So let's wait a couple of minutes so we can let the people in.
I waited for a while to get in, about 20 minutes.
But you're here now. That's what matters. Welcome.
That's right. Thank you for accepting me, finally.
Okay, let's start. Good morning and good afternoon from UNESCO headquarters in Paris, and welcome to the 5th edition of the UNESCO series of regional expert consultations against racism and discrimination. My name is Anna Maria Meilev, and I am the acting chief of the Inclusion and the Rights section. Welcome to all of you. Let me first of all remind everybody that English and French interpretation is available during this online meeting, and you can actually choose the language by clicking on the globe on your screen. And we would like to begin by presenting you a short video that was published by UNESCO earlier this year. It is called United Against Racism, and it rallies leading personalities to together fight against racial discrimination. The video clip is also available on UNESCO's YouTube channel, as well as on other social medias. Please, Shahad.
Many of us like to think of racism as something from the past, something that no longer holds sway over our societies, something that no longer exists.
But World War II took place less than a century ago. Survivors of the Holocaust are still alive today.
The Jim Crow's laws were enforced until 1965.
L'apartheid a été une réalité jusqu'en 1991.
We live in a world where people face barriers to education, employment, health, justice, and culture just because of the color of their skin.
Where people are discriminated against, excluded, stigmatized, attacked, or even murdered.
Just because of where they come from, what they look like, or what they believe in.
No more.
No more.
No more.
Hoy decimos basta.
El racismo y la discriminación son causados por la ignorancia y el miedo a lo que creemos diferente.
ويخترقان هياكلنا الإدارية وثقافتنا الشعبية وتحيزنا وفرضياتنا اللاواعية.
But this doesn't have to be the case.
You, me, us, we can create the change that we want.
By defending quality education for all, we can combat the root causes of deadly stereotypes and prejudices.
By developing historical knowledge and critical thinking, we can improve our understanding of the past.
By encouraging cultural diversity, especially at the local level, we can build societies that are more respectful of others.
By empowering the younger generation,
we can help them shape the world to come.
So, stop watching from the sideline.
Read, observe, learn, and listen.
We must hold ourselves accountable.
We must hold our societies accountable.
We are all one humanity.
Keep quiet is not an option.
Is not an option.
Di lo que piensas.
Speak up.
Speak up. Take action.
Take action.
Take action.
Thank you very much, Shahad. So that was UNESCO's video, United Against Racism. Please go and find it, look at it again, and diffuse it to all your networks. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mrs. Gabriela Ramos, who is the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO, and she is going to deliver the opening remarks and also set the agenda. Mrs. Ramos, please.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, and again, good afternoon for Asia Pacific, good morning for Europe. And I'm very pleased to open this 5th edition of UNESCO series of regional expert consultation against racism and discrimination. I think that the video really embodies what we are trying to do here, which is to take action and to learn from our experts around the world, from the distinguished experts that have accompanied us on all the editions of these discussions, and particularly today. I want to welcome Christine Dari from the Organization of Migration, Professor Sohail Inayatullah, I hope I pronounce it well, who is a UNESCO chairholder in Future Studies of Australia, Mr. Alexander Irwan, Regional Director of the Ford Foundation, Indonesia, Mrs. Rausan Naurisbayeva, Executive Director of the Development of Civil Society, Kazakhstan, Professor Ngo Shin, Director of the Gwangju International Center, and the moderator of today will be Sue Bais, who is a Regional Advisor for Social and Human Science in the Asia Pacific in Bangkok. We launched these consultations certainly because we have witnessed an increase of anti-racism and racism and discrimination all around the world. I don't need to put all the figures in front of you. You know them. I guess that you come to this debate because you are as worried as we are in terms of how much politics, societal changes, international relations are being colored by extreme assertions of nationalism, populism, and discrimination. And we are witnessing horror things happening, like what happened in France against Professor Sam Paty, and these excesses are really confronting us with the shared reality that things need to change. Since its creation, UNESCO has been fighting against racism and discrimination, illustrating its long legacy around the issues which have always been at the heart of our mandate. From the initial initiatives led by Claude Lévi-Strauss in the 50s, to the normative work such as the adoption of the Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice in 1978, and to the programmatic activities like the Slave Route Project, the General History of Africa, the Masterclass Series Against Racism and Discrimination that Ana Maria launched just recently, and the work of the International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities. Our house, UNESCO, is demonstrating that we have this strong commitment to fight racism and discrimination through the years. We just launched, thanks to a very strong mandate of our members, the elaboration of a recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence, and looking at how much this impressive digital revolution is not just translating the biases and the problems you encounter in the analog world into the digital world. And therefore we should go also deep into the science and the artificial intelligence. And so we need to put on the table the harsh realities that are endured by the groups that are being discriminated, and to move forward with the meaningful agenda. So what I would call on our experts today, and the dialogue that we have today, is to, of course, share their expertise in terms of how things happen and how can they be addressed. But more than anything, to think together how we can upscale our efforts to go against discrimination. And the magnitude of the movements that we are witnessing today, not only on Black Lives Matters, but also the different minority groups in many countries, are telling us that we are bound to change, and that we need to take this opportunity also to advance better policies and to advance better decisions on these issues. And these movements have real significance because they are an appeal to the essence of humanity, to act justly, to embrace diversity, and treat one another with value and respect despite our differences. So it's imperative that all sectors of our societies, individual governments, organizations, and institutions hear this call to action and work together towards eradicating racism and discrimination once and for all. And we know that this has become even worse in the COVID pandemic, or I would say the COVID pandemic just illustrates the state of the world and how much the groups that are being discriminated historically are also confronted with more challenges and being more harmful, impacted by the pandemic, because the initial conditions are, of course, not the best that they can have. So with this consultation, we are looking to break down and to understand existing barriers in societies by understanding the different facets surrounding racism and discrimination, and by providing insights toward addressing them around their given context and specificities. In some countries, these barriers have manifested themselves as obstacles to political participation, where a number of groups have been disenfranchised and experienced difficulties as a result of systemic exclusion they are faced with. The lack of political participation is a real problem, because then their voices does not exist, and the racist sentiments remain prevalent in some countries, including schools, the workplace, or access to government jobs. There are government systematic discrimination. There are discrimination based on religion, and we know some of the worst experiences also happening in the region of Southeast Asia. And many Asian Pacific countries experience tension and violence in view of their multi-ethnical and multicultural societies. And the large-scale communal and ideological conflict that have occurred resulted in ethnic violence, with a significant increase in incidents related to identity, citing a frequency of more than 3 times in the 2010 to the 2014 period. We know that you can be discriminated and try to convert against your religion, and this happens in many countries. We know that indigenous peoples are not spared from the widespread discrimination, and it continues to affect various facets of their everyday life, spanning from cultural, social, economical, and political spheres, leaving many of them marginalized and impoverished. There are approximately 470 million indigenous people worldwide. The vast majority of them, 70%, live in the Asia and the Pacific region. In addition, they account for about 15% of the extreme poor in the world. Meanwhile, persons with disabilities endure a similar hardship as a result of discrimination against them in the region. Less than 5% of children with disabilities are attending school, with women and girls having even less access to education due to double discrimination and experience. And discrimination against the LGBT community in Asia and the Pacific also remains a significant issue, with some countries being grounds for hostility and prejudice against this group. In addition, migration is another area in which there is a lot of discrimination, in which we leave all these people behind. And then, of course, women, always women, and gender-based discrimination, We wish we were talking about something else, but women are also core to this situation, and we have seen the fact that COVID had made things worse, increasing violence and increasing plain threats to the integrity and to the survival of women. A recent United Nations multi-country study of men and violence in the Asian Pacific reveals that 10 to 62% of all interviewed men reporting having raped a woman or a girl in their lifetime. It also shows that in some places, more than 75% of women aged 15 to 24 think that there are conditions under which it is justified for a man to beat his wife. This is terrible because we're talking about the younger generation. And as a global UN Women student from last April show that fewer women than men receive necessary information to prepare for the COVID-19, leaving them and their families more vulnerable to the outbreak. But in these times of the pandemic, they also have less access to medical care and health insurance, while simultaneously bearing the brunt of increased levels of unpaid care, domestic work, stress and risk of losing jobs and sources of income. This is especially the case for women informal workers that are already living in poverty. And for this reason, we believe that capacity building and awareness raising initiatives within the framework of the work that we're doing related to the legal systems can really help up to close the gaps that I have just mentioned. We want to advance in reviewing the legal and institutional frameworks. We start by that. We need to legislate equality, and by addressing the data gaps in an effort to ensure science-informed decisions. We aspire to advance this knowledge and understanding on the issue of racism and discrimination in order to take concerted, careful, and collective action through participatory and holistic mechanisms such as this consultation. And we will continue with our commitment against this evil. We will continue with our programs and initiatives against racism and discrimination, but we are very, very pleased that we have this group of wonderful experts, that we have our participants to share insights, to share new ways of addressing the issue, to share with us positive experiences. We are sad at putting the problems in the table, but we need to be optimistic that we will find solutions with your help. So I wish you the best, and looking forward to the debate. And now I suppose I give the floor to our moderator.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Ramos, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody from Bangkok. As mentioned, my name is Sue Vise, and I am the Regional Advisor for the Social and Human Sciences program here in Asia Pacific. I also have the pleasure to come from the region, so I do know it a little more than the rest of the world. As also mentioned by Ms. Ramos, this is the 5th in a series of these consultations that are being held in every region of the world, so that this discussion can actually focus on the differences and the specificities of each region. Each one is a little bit different. We've also just heard a little bit about how diverse Asia Pacific is, which of course you all know. We have so much cultural and ethnic diversity, we have religious diversity, and we also have a really mobile population in this part of the world. And living in our big cities, our mega cities in Asia Pacific, I think is a good example of the kind of melting pot we have of different peoples coming together. So of course, the purpose of these discussions is for us to unpack some of these issues as they're specific to the region, and to think about what could be some of the accountable actions that could form the basis of ongoing programmatic work that might be done by UNESCO or our partners. So as we all know, the pandemic has highlighted a number of issues, and they've been reported across the media, I think in nearly every country, and that the targets of the discrimination and racism vary by country, but it's something that has definitely been on the increase. So today we're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of speakers who are able to join us and firstly give us some thoughts on the kind of issues and happenings that they see and what are the underpinning reasons behind some of that. And then secondly, to be able to answer some of your questions. So our panelists, I will just briefly introduce each of them. Firstly, we have Professor Sohail Inayatullah, who is the UNESCO Chairholder in Future Studies from Australia. Professor Sohail has a lot of experience from around the region, having also had professorships in Taipei and Malaysia, as well as in Australia. And his work in futures literacy is well known and recognized globally. In fact, he received the Laurel Award for the all-time best futurist by the Shaping Tomorrow Foresight Network in 2011. And he works closely with UNESCO on a number of projects related to futures literacy. So it's great to have Sohail here today. We're also joined by Ms. Kristen Dady, who is based with the International Organization of Migration in the Philippines. She is the Chief of Mission there. She's been working with IOM for many years in a number of countries in Asia, in Cambodia and Indonesia, but also in other regions. And in particular, she has done a lot of work around human trafficking and developing partnerships for welcoming migrants into communities when they change to new countries. We're also joined by Dr. Meghna Guhatakuta, who is a member of the governing body executive director of IID, and she teaches or has taught international relations at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, and she's currently working for the RIB in Bangladesh. And she has a lot of experience with social studies and publishing around issues related to partition history, obviously in South Asia. Diversity and conflict in society has been ongoing for a very long time. We're also joined by Ms. Raushan Naurizbayeva, I apologize, Executive Director of the Development of Civil Society, which is an NGO based in Kazakhstan. And Dr. Raushan, as well as being involved in civil society, has previously been very involved in civic education in Kazakhstan. She was working with the Kazakh State Legal Academy and the Ministry of Education to produce educational methodologies and curricula, particularly around promoting the rights of women and minorities. So it's great to have her here today. And finally, we in Korea, good and familiar part, and most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, with the World Human Rights Cities Forum, which Gwangju City hosts every year. And the Gwangju International Center is, I guess, a leading body that actually looks at integration in society and bringing communities together. And I visited them myself a couple of times now and seen some of the work they do with the communities locally in Gwangju to assist people of all different backgrounds to come together. And I'll just mention that unfortunately, Mr. Alexander Irwin is unable to join us today because of a last-minute urgent issue that came up. So we will be moving on without Alex. So the way that we're going to do this today, firstly, we're going to ask each of the panelists to discuss a series of general and discuss with. So for your responses, that will be questions to each of the panelists, and then we'll be opening up for questions and answers from the audience. And you have received a message telling you about the Q&A function, which is where you will put your questions, which I can then feed through to the panelists. So this first round of questions is just to set a bit of a framework for today's discussion and dialogue. And so I will ask the panelists to just give us some general remarks about some of these issues. So how has racism evolved up to the current COVID-19 context? And what intersectional discriminations are emerging and re-emerging now because of the COVID-19 pandemic? And do you see gender-based discrimination and racial discrimination emerging in that? So I'll just ask firstly, Professor Sohail, if you can give us your thoughts on those questions.
Thanks so much. My framework, of course, is futures and foresight, and very much trying to get conceptual frameworks to understand how we can work with reality and change reality. So clearly, I think one of my favorite quotes about COVID-19, it's making the invisible visible. So fault lines that were already there in society get heightened. And the way I try to come to terms with it is very much if you use the classical South Asian episteme or the Indic episteme to how do you make sense of this? So just briefly, one is they do something called tama or restrictive. So then I ask myself, what are some restrictive practices? And one, of course, leaders that blame others, that leads to heightened racism, heightened discrimination. The second is this framework called conspirituality, that even those on spiritual paths who are allegedly open towards alternatives, they've gone to in this conspiracy mode, looking for secret indicators, secret groups. So this is very much the restrictive phase. So the first thing when I work with groups, I say, are you in a restrictive phase or something else? So this is what's called tama. So many stay in that phase, blame others, and of course, look for conspiracy. And so our goal as social change agents is always to change that. So then we move towards something called raja or active. So what's active? And clearly the best we're seeing is scientists sharing information, large companies sharing information, sharing data, and there's not an issue of race or discrimination. They're trying to create a better world. So approach one is where we restrict and become more racist. Approach two is we look for actions that in fact can move us forward. So I always look for data of that world. Now the approach three, really what's crucial here is what you might call sattva or pure, which is, can we see COVID-19 as a portal to a different world? So then we start to look at what are some experiences of people saying, well, here are some positive changes. How do we accentuate those positive changes? So I always try to get groups and countries to go from this restrictive to active to actually a transformational discourse. And the critical part here is always, which is the narrative that stops us, which is the narrative that helps us. We were having a meeting with international policing, and the one thing that came out very strongly, we had a Singapore leader, and this was crucial for me in the actual discussion. They said we were early, we were decisive, we were science-informed policy, not race-informed policy. However, when we were doing that, we forgot our core hidden narrative. And the core hidden narrative, he said, is we still have a hierarchical view of reality. There's some groups above, some groups below, and thus COVID-19 came back through the migrant dormitories. So this experience has quickly heightened in society. Here's where we're open, inclusive, and it's working. And here, in fact, we've shown where, in fact, our society is based on strategies that hurt minorities and strategies that make everything worse. So the argument that has been very clear, if we wish a post-COVID-19 world that's healthier, more equitable, safer, then it's moving towards this transformative discourse and getting very clear what parts of society have we designed around racial hierarchy and where are we flat and pushing equality. So that would be my first way of trying to frame this. And COVID-19 has heightened those areas where there is discrimination and clearly said we can't stay in this position. So discrimination here is the inefficiencies of racial, gender discrimination get even more advanced. And the possibility of transformation, of course, is equally more advanced because things are unstable. Change is more possible and change is actually more difficult.
Thank you for that. Dr. Meghna, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. Well, for the first question about how racism has evolved. My approach is more political economy. So I look at two things which helps to organize to see the trends behind what we see today. And that is, one is the kind of, from the 60s onwards, the withering away of welfare functions of the state, which is, I mean, for the present time, we see a lot of emphasis on care and the lack of care, or care, how to access care infrastructure, or the whole sort of gaps in the care infrastructure, whether it is health, whether it is physical or mental, or whether it is looking after people. So a lot of it, and we see our states and our nations suffering from this inability to, those states especially, who has sort of given away this care facilities or the faculties of the state, which used to be there. They had been sort of in the interest of free market. A lot of it has been in the marketized or commercialized, and that is where a lot of groups, minority groups, or underserved groups in communities cannot access those care facilities anymore. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why we see a heightened form of racism, or at least racist tendencies, because of this the gap in the two kind of between the haves and have-nots, you could say, or between those who are underserved. And that's why COVID-19 statistically is affecting those communities, especially who has less access. And of course, within that are racial minorities and women. The second trend that I see that is noticeable in the past years or decades is the increase, and you've said that as well, that increase in migration and both legal as well as illicit, and crossing of borders. And that has brought about in the past decades a kind of xenophobic tendency among many of the communities, which has created dissension and also divisions. And some of them are very much along racial lines. It has also affected the COVID-19 syndrome. As an example, I can say that we all know that from 2017, a large influx of the Rohingya population from Myanmar, Rakhine State, has come into Bangladesh. And it's as if they are undergoing a double discrimination or racial. As it is, there is stigmatization of them as refugees. And on top of that, there is a stigmatization that they will be carryers of COVID-19, or it will spread more from them. And it's very strangely enough, it is the same kind of discourse that is there in Myanmar, and at the same time at the official circles or at the societal circles. So it's a very, and it is also a kind of stigmatization of such groups. And the COVID-19 has brought about very, very starkly, I would say. It has been found that actually in the areas where the camps are, the Rohingya camps are, it is not, the COVID-19 was not spread through the refugees. It was spread more from the host community and into the refugees. And it is a scientific fact which has not been revealed, and hence the prejudicial tendencies, they are reinforced both in Myanmar as well as in Bangladesh. So these are, this is where the existing sort of two trends of the lack of inaccessibility of racial groups and the minorities to access proper care, health facilities, and at the same time migrations churning up xenophobia in our societies. And in terms of your second question, which is the sectional discrimination, I will very much focus on the gender and the ethnic intersectionalism that goes on. In the past, when we've been working with underserved groups like the Dalits or the ethnic groups, we have seen that again, the resources, the constriction of resources is one of the factors that is responsible for more discrimination against women. So in a community where there is not enough resources to go around, but if that community is very much part of a patriarchal system, we have seen that, that women tend to be discriminated against property, ownership of property in terms of education and literacy, healthcare. And that has increased in terms of the COVID-19 because such resources have been even more constricted in, due to lack of mobility, due to social distancing, and almost the cessation of economic activities among vulnerable groups. And women have been very much a victim of that, that kind of a circle, vicious circle. I'll stop here and then maybe continue later.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to hear that it's kind of happening the other way around from what it appears to be. And I guess I would say I see some of that too sometimes. It's quite interesting. Kristen, could we ask you to answer the questions next?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much to UNESCO for putting on this really important panel discussion. And thanks to the two previous panel members, Sohail and Meghna, who already touched upon the issue of migration. I mean, in relation to the first question, yes, definitely. I mean, as the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres recognized, the pandemic has really continued to unleash a tsunami of xenophobia, scapegoating, and scaremongering. You know, the fear and anxiety and stigmatization against migrants was already there. But in fact, I mean, the pandemic has really just exacerbated that. And we've seen that with countless examples. I mean, the most obvious of which coming up with an alternative name for COVID-19, you know, calling it the Chinese virus, or, you know, sensationalizing blaming particular communities of origin for bringing it in. And we've seen that in Asia, where there's been an increase in attacks against Asians, and particularly those of Chinese descent. We've seen that all across Asia, where Chinese migrants themselves have been really subject to verbal attacks across Europe and Asia, where Asian Americans are have been subjected to horrifically violent attacks. And so, yes, it's definitely exacerbated it. And the International Organization for Migration, are obviously extremely concerned about that. I'm just going to touch upon, because I think the two panelists already laid out the issues very clearly. I think the narrative is something that we're very much working on and needs to change, because the narrative has been that migrants are the ones spreading the disease. But as Meghna pointed out earlier, that's not based on fact. I mean, the community transmission happening here, for example, is not being spread amongst migrants themselves. It's amongst the local populations. And so we really need to have a narrative that is based on, you know, accurate information. And in fact, I mean, at IOM, we've been trying to promote this narrative that it's been the migrant communities that have been the frontline workers. They've been the ones that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. They've been on the front lines in the healthcare industries. Our headquarters are in Switzerland, and more than 50% of the workers, healthcare workers, are migrant. They've been the ones, particularly when we look at the second question of the intersection with gender, female migrant healthcare workers have been disproportionately affected by the virus. They've had a higher death rate than those that have not been. So they've been in the food sector. When we look at essential services, when we had so many lockdowns across Europe, across the US, here in Asia, we've had lockdowns. It's been the migrant communities that continue to deliver those essential services. So we really need to build that accurate narrative on migration and what migrants have done in terms of frontline response and in terms of really being the frontline heroes in this response. And I think it's easy to do because when you look at this panel themselves and you look at probably all the attendees here, we are all migrants. I mean, we just don't see ourselves as that, but sometimes we call ourselves expats, which is really not accurate. We have this great campaign called I'm a Migrant. And so we really need to have those narratives more fleshed out and really put forth and it has to be a whole of society approach. It can't just be our political leaders who are sometimes capitalizing on this racist and white supremacist agenda, but really we need to work at the community level and counter these narratives that are so toxic and dangerous. So just a few initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I find that particularly interesting because migrants are on the front line here, but in fact, the welfare systems that we have, they're often the ones that are excluded from the support and getting access to healthcare, the kind of welfare incentives that many governments have been given to people who lose their jobs and things. And of course, migrants often don't qualify for those. Even in rich countries like in Australia, where I'm from, all the foreign students basically didn't receive any help and they're stranded there. So, you know, it's quite an interesting thing given that they're playing such a role, but yet they're excluded from a lot of the responses.
Exactly.
Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Raushan, who's in Kazakhstan, a different part of Asia. So it will be very interesting to hear some of the background from Central Asia.
She has to unmute herself.
Raushan, can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, can hear you now. Please go ahead.
So COVID-19 this increase already exists in some inequality in Kazakhstan. So mostly this impact to the women and people who sick of HIV and the LGBT, and they during the pandemic they don't receive the adequate medical assistance because most medical institutions and clinics in Kazakhstan are focused on the providing medical assistance to the people who are sick by COVID. And these people unfortunately received the less and sometimes in some region the absent of the medical assistance. So also there is some problem with this pandemic, include to the gender domestic violence in the families, and also that decrease that incomes in most family, because some organization was received transfer to the distance type of activity. Some of people lose the work during the pandemic, which also to negatively impact to the good picture of the this issue. Also, the most assistant during the pandemic, the many of Kazakhstani NGO, they call the united efforts in order to fight with the COVID. but unfortunately we have in the some period of the pandemic during this 6 months, the Kazakhstan has a restriction to the aircraft and the international transportation, and which also negatively influence to the funding of the some NGO who receive the international assistance, and therefore this NGO cannot in the full volume to provide the assistance to the vulnerable group of the population. Before in the February there is a in February it was the call of the Kazakhstani NGO organization to fight, to unite the efforts in Nur-Sultan, the capital of the Kazakhstan, to fight focusly on with COVID. And to disbalance of the connection between the enterprises, NGO, some state assistant, to negatively influence on the whole situation, with especially with the vulnerable group of the population. Regarding the racism in Kazakhstan generally live more than 100 nationality and ethnic groups. However, in Kazakhstan has very good tolerant state policy, and we are peacefully sustained with many ethnic group and nationality. The evidence of this good situation with racism, it was that we don't have in Kazakhstan, don't have the civil conflict and war on the national basis. But in the same time, I, as a professional lawyer, I think that it is very important to raise the problem of to fight with racism in Kazakhstan, because situation can be changed very rapidly, and due to the COVID challenge, that the situation can be changed, and we need to prevent some racism in Kazakhstan. We need to prevent. So we need to work in some different areas: the state policy, of course, the NGO, educational organization, and as maybe you know, in Kazakhstan, many educational organization, university, institution are transferred to the distance learning right now, and it was some kind of technical problem. For example, for a family who has a few children, some children, the family has only one computer, and the problem is provide them the computer in order to to continue the educational process. And especially the situation is very bad in some villages in the countryside, in the family who has a few children. And some school and colleges try to assist by computer and device this like poor and vulnerable family in Kazakhstan, but this assistance is not enough. And not cover that all entire territory of Kazakhstan, of course. Hello?
Thank you for that. Again, very interesting, particularly the point relating to getting the balance between, the state action, community action, the private sector. I think this is another aspect of COVID that in a way, it's forcing the different sectors to come together, whereas often in the past, we tend to keep them fairly separate. So Professor Shin, we'd like you to also now come in and think about these questions from your perspective, if you could. Thank you.
In some sense, or Koreans are lucky at this pandemic crisis because we have quite low number of cases, as well as the government is quite reasonable, not promoting any hate against any other countries or groups or regions. But still, in this kind of situation, discrimination seems to be quite spontaneous and then stronger in crisis, as in the case of Nazi in 1930s. But in Korea, as I mentioned, the number of cases was quite low, and then it is well contained. But still, there are some discrimination against the groups from which the first outbreak started in last March. So quite tragically, 2 women from that religious group committed suicide. So no man committed suicide, which means the women are more discriminated at home, probably in society as well. So when I look up the statistics at that time, at the beginning of coronavirus outbreak, I found that generally speaking, the people, more than half of the population, experienced or witnessed discrimination against the religious group, which began the first outbreak. And then again, so the coronavirus carriers or patients, they experienced also discrimination. Some Chinese experienced discrimination. So discrimination still exists here, even though it has not been so significant in other parts of the world. I believe that we are lucky again because of the reasonable government. So that government try not to blame any country, any other groups of people. So I really believe that the good government is really important even more at the time of crisis. So I want to talk about it more later, but still education again important, because education train younger folks not to be discriminatory, and then mass media also important. I found that some newspapers and then broadcasting systems carry the stories of coronavirus patients, many good stories, like some patient living in an apartment, he never used elevator. He always took stairs, not to be exposed his coronavirus to any other people. That kind of good stories exposed to the general public lowered the discrimination against coronavirus case, the patients, or even some women, because the mass media exposed quite a lot the doctors and nurses who suffered from hard work in taking care of the coronavirus cases. So in that regard, I thought Koreans are lucky, but still we also experience certain amount of coronavirus discrimination. I will talk more about my experience later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And in fact, the second question that I wanted to ask actually relates to that, because, you know, the last time we had a global pandemic of this kind of scale with the Spanish flu, we didn't have internet. We didn't have, it took like 2 weeks for news to get from one place to another. So this pandemic is actually playing out in a kind of an entirely different, connected, globalized world. And one of the, in particular, the Black Lives Matters campaign has kind of been playing out in parallel to this particular pandemic. And I know it hasn't been such a big thing in Asia, but I think that it shows that the connections are happening, like the global indicators on racism are there and they happen at the same time. So what is the influence and how has this influenced the dialogue around racism and discrimination with COVID? Professor Shin, would you like to take that since you were talking about the media already? Your mute's on.
So as I explained, the COVID virus cases or this crisis does not or did not give rise to much about controversy in Korea, but some people promoted anti-Chinese rhetoric or anti the religious group rhetoric. But quite luckily, the government tried to play down that kind of rhetoric a lot. Again, another luck we have is that the city which had the largest number of cases in Korea happened to be very conservative. So they tend to blame others for any crisis, but this time they suffered from coronavirus outbreak. And then, for example, the city of Gwangju accommodated patients from that region. We also sent medical staff to help them. So we experienced many good things under this coronavirus pandemic. Even though we have some crises as well, and then some tragedies as well, as I mentioned, there were two people committed suicide. Also, in the last August 15, there were very many political rallies in Seoul. Then the government tried to block it because the rallies can spread the coronavirus. And then after that, we had a second phase of outbreak. So we are still experiencing conflict among different groups, and then second phase outbreak and blaming each other. But the intensity of the blaming game does not involve migrant, for example, or women as well. So in certain extent, we are experiencing tragic incidents or conflict, but still I think it is a time for us to grow further. I'm not sure whether I answered your question very well.
Well, maybe there's not really an answer as such, but it's an opportunity to dialogue. So Kristen, would you like to also comment on this question?
Sure. I think Mr. Shin points something out that's really key and important. The countries that have been the most inclusive in their response have been the ones that have been most effective in combating coronavirus. Those political leaders that have chosen to, really contribute to this xenophobic, racist narrative on COVID have been the countries with the worst response, frankly speaking. And I think it's also worth showing that the countries that have had the most effective response have been those led by female leaders, right? I mean, generally, and there's been a lot of interesting discussions on that. So, and there's been some, points raised that female leaders tend to listen to the science more so than our male counterparts. So I think it's really important to highlight, again, how do we counter this is by the accurate narrative on migration, that, migrants have been at the forefront of the response, but also looking to see what countries have really been the best in terms of combating the COVID-19, and as you see, Korea is a prime example, and that's because they've had a most inclusive response to it. And countries like New Zealand and Norway, Germany, they've been more inclusive in their response and making sure that they don't like perpetuate this xenophobic, racist agenda.
Thank you. It is interesting watching the countries' different responses and how they impact each other as well. So coming back to Professor Sohail, you were talking about the need to change the mindsets of individuals and populations. So how do you see us, what are the kinds of tools and ways that we could start to hope to change those mindsets?
Well, first, I really want to, comment, in terms of fully agreement with the other panelists. I know for me, I remember when my father, he talked about partition in South Asia. And there were buses taking Hindus from where we were in the Punjab back to India. And there was one old man and he had a bicycle. And my dad would have been 15 or 16. And the other 15-year-olds, they all got together and said, we're going to steal that bicycle from that man. He's Hindu, so we're just going to take it. And they went up to steal his bicycle, and my father just stopped them. He said, no, we're not Muslim, Hindu, Pakistani, Indian. We're first human beings. So that was really that we're first humanity, and that's always what's going to be first. And that was an act of agency where those 5-6 boys could have beaten him up, actually could have killed him, but he was very clear, humanity first. So COVID-19, we're seeing the nation states, as Christian said, that are putting humans first versus racial, sexist practices first. So those are those actions of individuals' agency. But my approach, as you may know, is called CLA, causal alert analysis. Let's go to depth. How do we measure this? So level 1 is the litany, the data. We need an Asia-Pacific real metrics of countries that are doing well in terms of inclusion, countries that aren't doing well in terms of inclusion, and a quick way to see that. So that's kind of level data. Level 2 analysis is, of course, what Gabriela said, ensure systems support an SCAP, and the debate became my air or our air. My air is individualistic. Our air, we create a platform for our air for the entire region. Then we have legislation to ensure there's no pollution. So that's level 2 analysis. Level 3 is worldview. And we know every tradition can either be open, Gaian, or things be exclusive, meaning nation state based or tribal based. So those are choices we can make. And so we're trying to decide every moment, am I deciding for inclusion? Do I have legislative systems that support inclusions? Do I have a culture or worldview that does that? And every tradition has both. Underneath all that, of course, is the metaphor. There's always a metaphor. That's decisive here. So with the Black Lives, when it was very clear, we're challenging the metaphor of white space. We want to shift the metaphor to Black Lives Matter. We're challenging the worldview of social Darwinism and shifting it to all citizens. We're challenging the system of police suppression, the system of discrimination, to actually a system where we recruit people who are good mediators, people who are inclusive. So if the data was who killed Floyd, in the alternative world, Floyd is not killed because he's a community leader. So this is the shift to say there's one individual agency or action, but in fact, we have to shift all four. The data we collect, the systems that support the data, the deep cultural worldview, and finally, the core metaphor. And COVID-19 is heightening that. Countries that are failing don't get it, and they'll keep on failing, and they'll keep on blaming. The countries who are succeeded, they understand inclusion from an evolutionary point of view is efficient. Exclusion is inefficient. Your cost will go up because people we excluded, you won't get their productivity, you won't get their spiritual inclusion, you won't get their cultural inclusion. And luckily we do have, as Christian said, female leaders who've understood that straight away versus other leaders who have been utterly disastrous for this period in human history.
Yep, very interesting. And I notice a lot of people are mentioning data and the importance that data actually can play in this. I think we can misuse data as well, and we had a couple of examples of that. So I'm wondering, Dr. Meghna, if you could actually talk a little bit about your work. And you do a lot of work on participatory action research. So how can this kind of methodology, you know, address these issues around an inclusive approach to data issues, coming up with policies that are, you know, inclusive and going to allow us to move forward in that manner that brings people together rather than pulling them apart?
Thank you. Yes, participatory action research has been one of our hallmarks of our organization, but that's not to say we don't do other work. However, we found it very useful because the agenda is something of whatever is being researched or whatever the problem is being trying to solve comes from the people themselves. So, and they are engaged in a group in a way where they are asked to identify problems, as many as possible, without any agenda given to them at first, but then prioritizing them and then taking action, and then after they've taken that action, reflected on it. So it's a kind of action, reflection, action cycle. And the whole, the reason why it is very effective in places where we did, where we do the work, and we've worked, our also other focus is marginalized communities, marginalized in every sense, ethnic, linguistic, gender, transgendered, I mean, whoever are marginalized, we try to build that inner strength and cohesiveness, and use the cohesiveness that they already have in that community, and try to get them to articulate it into policies and actions in a local way. So how we do that is we have facilitators, of course, but I think the hallmark, again, of the effectiveness of such programs is the action owned by the people themselves. So they, because it's their agenda and they take the action, we don't take the action on their behalf unless we are asked to. And so that's ownership is something that they have. And that, and the other thing is, of course, the sustainability, that because through this process of engaging in community discussions, arriving at consensus, it's a democratic process. Many call it dialogical. So what is finally the outcome is sustainability, because you are transferring or transforming such certain skills into that community, and asking them to develop it on themselves. So they, when you leave, we are a research organization, so we have to leave. We are not giving them service or any delivery after the research, but they will take up those tasks. As an example, I can tell you, again, if we go back to that, currently we do have a program of mitigating tensions between the refugees and the host community in that Cox's Bazar area. It's been a very interesting program, very short, unfortunately, and of course, impeded by the lockdown and the social distancing and the lack of mobility. But even then, we found that the host community, this xenophobia, as I said, as well as hate speech, as well as you know, the division of or the in terms of distribution of resources, there is always an angst in the host community that the refugees are getting better facilities while they are, as citizens, are not. And so all these we have tried to address that with the host community. And we found that most of the host communities have been the first responders. As Sohail said, you know, they are these humanity spaces of humanity, even in a conflict zone. And one has to, you know, allow that to come to surface and be articulated and be used to evolve into a discourse of humanity. And how we did that was that we asked the community, the host community, but look, you're saying all this against, and of course, one of the typical characteristics of hate speech is that you go by stereotypes. You are this, you are, the Rohingyas are hostile, they are prone to violence, and all these kind of stereotypes are built. But when you ask them, and we encourage them to ask themselves, but why did you go to help them? Why did you give them food when you had none? And it is the same thing in the COVID period as well, when people were helping others. And it is this cohesiveness and this community sense that really brought out their humanity. And then they had answers to that. But the fact is that neither the government nor the local administration is recognizing this host community for what they have done. Rather, they would, recognize government programs or NGO programs or international UN bodies, but no one would be recognizing these first responders of the humanitarian crisis. And it's very interesting that once you start getting them discussing these things, they redefine the spaces of humanity and can develop them. So that's how effective it is, that within the locality, there are also a lot of problems that they do face because of the influx. For example, because there has been an illegal outmigration from the refugees seeking illegal passports, Bangladeshi passports, so they can travel abroad, etc. So birth registration was stopped because birth certificates was a document which they could use to get such facilities. But the birth registration was also stopped even in the host community. And that is where mothers expressed a concern that no one is hearing our voice, that my child is being born in a COVID period, but he or she is not getting a birth certificate. What will happen to her or him when they go to school? Will the government be giving backdated birth certificates to us? On what basis? How long is it going to go in for? So we've used, as part of the action, training them in RTI, right to information, and making applications to local governments. And that's how they've been able to communicate with their local administration on their particular concerns. These are agendas which we did not formulate for them, but agendas which they developed themselves. And that's how it works.
Thank you so much. And it's great that you touched on the way that communities take action, because that leads very nicely into my next question, which is to Raushan, which is about how effective is civil society in initiating action? And do you have any examples?
Thank you for your question. Yes, in Kazakhstan, the vast majority of the NGO in Kazakhstan are leader of NGO are female. So they are very active, especially in the pandemic. But due to some restriction and limitation during the pandemic, they arrange some webinar, some online training in order to raise the awareness of women and different parts of the population. And I would like to say that there is a very famous NGO which called Bolashak. It's located in Jambu, Taras, Kazakhstan, Taras city. So the head of this organization, Galia Kalieva, during the pandemic, provides humanitarian aid to the migrants. And unfortunately, during this action, she was infected and she was died during the pandemic. She's a very human rights defender, very famous. In the same time, I would say that activity of the NGO in Kazakhstan focus, some of the activity focus on the some activity to provide the awareness during the pandemic, and some activity of the NGO is the ordinary activity. For example, during the pandemic, it was arranged the round table and the project of the increasing numbers of female community on gender budgeting in the West Oblast of Kazakhstan. And it was held by a consultative committee on cooperation and cooperation with the non-governmental organization, and in Nur Sultan, in the format of the video conference. Also, I would say that it is very important right now because many women are remain without some income, so to retrain them to the different specialty, especially women, in order to avoid some unemployment among women as the most vulnerable part of the population. How effective the intervention are very effective of civil society, but not in the entire territory of Kazakhstan. Some, as I mentioned, that Bolashak in the south of Kazakhstan is very effective because we have very strong civil society organization, and Almaty, of course, Nur Sultan is the capital, and the south of Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, that many action, the public hearing of arranged by the NGO was cancelled due to the pandemic, and because of the restriction. And but now, by time to time, that some organization is try to connect the and arrange meeting on the mutual basis, and express the joint assistance and joint efforts in order to express the joint statement of the non-governmental organization to fight with the COVID. Thanks.
Thank you. It's I actually think there's been so much grassroots kind of action from all kinds of things, feeding people, making masks, and it's really great to see community groups stepping up. We've heard about...
excuse me, I have a question. Due to, I apologize, but I need to leave the meeting after 20 minutes at latest. So is it possible to, I mean, that if I share the different two other questions, if you allowed me? If not, because...
you want to comment on the other questions?
Yes, if it is possible. I mean,
if you can be brief, because we're a little bit over time.
Okay. So, unfortunately, in Kazakhstan, there is almost no analytic data on racism and discrimination. Only few organizations like NGO and the university are focused on the research on discrimination and racism. I participate in the project with my Hungarian colleagues in 2009, funded by Soros Foundation Kazakhstan, to comparative characteristic of the anti-discrimination policy in Kazakhstan and Hungary. But unfortunately, as I said, very few analytic research and data on this issue, and this is not political, not a lack of the political will. I think that we need to assist and reinforce the efforts of the NGO organization to provide and arrange that analytic research on discrimination and racism, especially gender discrimination. For example, in Kazakhstan, female receive about 73% of the salary of men. Salary of men, and only in the third sector of economic of Kazakhstan, it's health, social services, and education. The woman receives the salary the same as with the men. But in other sector, we have only, depends from the different region of Kazakhstan, we have only 73%. And this situation is not changed since 2010, unfortunately. And another problem of the equality and the gender equality in Kazakhstan, that the top position in the education, the business, the social services are occupied by men. And our organization, we arranged a few seminars with financial support of UNESCO, and we highlight this problem that we need to change the situation. But in the same time, enrollment of girls and boys in the university, we have the interesting situation because in Kazakhstan we have the positive discrimination, because more girls have opportunity to enroll to the university. So depends from the university type of the university. For example, there is some creative art. There is some sector of the arts which is it's not attractive for girls because it's physically difficult to make the sculpture. So only this specialty are mostly occupied by boys, for example. At the same time, I would say that we have some stereotypes. There is some real like female profession, real men's profession. So we have such stereotypes, and we need to fight with this. And the educational level of female in Kazakhstan approximately higher than men, and also that the last question to you, if you allowed me.
We're actually just about out of time, so if I can come back to one of the other speakers, and we'll come back to you if we can.
Thank you. Sorry.
So, Kristen, we've heard quite a lot about the need to change the narrative, and we've also heard about the need to bring the different elements of society together. And I think this is something that international organizations often look at. And, you know, how effective can we be when we develop kind of frameworks to bring these together to try to change that narrative as like in a systematic way?
Yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to make a comment on something you said earlier, Susan, about healthcare systems, national healthcare systems being inclusive. I think that's been a good example where you've had countries that have had inclusive healthcare systems, healthcare for all, regardless of your status, irregular, illegal. Those have been really effective. You know, as the Secretary General said, if you leave behind the most vulnerable, you're not going to have an effective response. So I think it's critically important in a health pandemic. You have to have national healthcare frameworks in place that are inclusive and allow for testing, treatment across the board. Otherwise, you won't be able to, you know, effectively combat that. And WHO has a lot on that. But of course, in terms of just frameworks to combat xenophobia, racism, it's really important that states, you know, and governments adapt their laws to what the current situation is. So we've seen increase online hate speech, and so countries, there's been some good examples of countries putting in place more effective laws to combat, hate speech online, holding those platforms accountable. And then we've seen a lot of good examples of communities countering that online hate speech, particularly as it relates to migrants. So I think that, there are lots of different frameworks, legal, but also community-based, that really we can effectively combat exclusion. And there's lots of online examples, resources at the UN COVID website that I would direct folks to, un.org, where you can find a whole COVID page that would provide a lot of those examples for those listeners today.
Thank you, Kristen. And of course, we need networks and international networks to work together. So a final comment from Professor Shin around how effective international networks can actually play a role in this before we take some of the questions from the audience.
In fact, international collaboration was quite effective in Korea. So I want to talk about politics again. When the first outbreak was serious in Korea, the mass media, established powerful mass media, continued to criticize government policy. But international media began to point out how effective Korean government policy of containment of coronavirus. So without international media, the Korean government would have failed with their policy. So I wanted to point it out before I go further. So in that regard, the international, not only collaboration, but also sharing of information itself seems to be very important. So the Korean government, even though Christine mentioned the female leadership was successful, it sounds quite a lot discriminating against me or against other males, but I'm joking. But I can agree with you that the male chauvinistic leaders all failed at this time. So coronavirus showed what kind of leadership we need. I'm not sure whether the world learned it or not. So in that regard, so populist male chauvinistic leadership should be rejected. That I think many people already learned about it. So I consider female leadership seems to be more reasonable, more understanding, more inclusive. In addition, you mentioned about national healthcare system. Koreans did not know whether their healthcare system is good or not before. But throughout this experience of coronavirus pandemic, we learned that we have very nice national healthcare system. So the people are more willing to pay the healthcare due every month. So it is another good thing. And then again, I want to talk about NGO involvement, because progressive NGO groups continue to support government policies, and then they continue to work against hate speech, against women, against migrants, for example, against like LGBTQ groups. So NGO groups collaboration as well as international collaboration seems to be very important. But still we have also very conservative, ultra-conservative NGO groups who are criticizing the government in collaboration with very conservative, powerful mass media. But still, the conflict gives us dynamics. So I accept that kind of conflict to be quite productive for our future.
Thank you
again,
for that.
One more comment. May I talk about the forum or later?
Oh, can we just go to a couple of questions from the audience first, and then some final remarks from the panelists? So I put a couple of questions there for you, and there's a few people asking about education, but there's also one that's particularly mentioned something that you just touched on, which is around hate speech and the fact that this is fueling a lot of the racism and discrimination. So the question is actually, how can we approach those who are fueling the discrimination. We often approach this, I guess maybe from the top down, but we're not necessarily connecting to the people who are fueling the hate speech and online kind of network. So I'll open that up to any of the panelists that would like to respond. So just flag to me if you would like to respond. And the other question was about education and the fact that the gaps are opening up now. So children from disadvantaged communities and in disadvantaged countries are starting to fall behind. So how can we kind of address those systems through the things that we've been talking about? So who would like to take one of those questions?
Probably.
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
Can
so
I take the
Professor
one
Shidi?
about hate speech?
Sure, please, Dr. Mena.
Yes, it's true that with the internet being more and more the vehicle of communication, and our communities, although everyone may not have a laptop, but definitely in Bangladesh, for example, everyone has a phone, and the phone connection is amazing. So the connectivity is really, I mean, even down to the grassroots, like, you know of Netflix, but many people doesn't know about certain phone kind of communication networks like Bongo, which shows films, and even to an agricultural wage labor may access it, and they do. So these are already that are online communication networks which one may avail. What the messages they are giving, what kind of entertainment they're giving is of course something. And again, there is a real problem about democratic arrangements and control arrangements. The civil society in Bangladesh is at a kind of even before the lockdown and COVID was in a problem where we recently had a Digital Security Act, which was meant to control such communications for the protection. But again, I will insist that you really have to look upon the nature of the state and the nature of the government and what kind of policies the government are having in order to stop hate speech. So sometimes the policies of the government are responsible for creating hate speech. Because if they are exclusive policies, excluding certain races, certain even gender, anti-woman policies, although, and sometimes they emit from societies. In pen and paper, the government may be saying exactly politically correct statements, but when it comes to the implementation by either law enforcing agencies or by the societal groups, then of course a lot of hate speech is being engendered. And we recently are now struggling with atrocious kind of an incident of a rape of a woman who was not even only raped, but beaten to death, not to death, sorry, almost to death, but she recovered and she was very brave. But the thing was that the whole incident was thrown open in the internet, so for everyone to see. Of course, because of pressure from the society, pressure from the women's movement, those accused have been arrested. But there is so much impunity in the justice system in many societies, in many states, that it is hard to believe that they will be getting justice unless you put the pressure on. So this is basically, I think, hate speech is more apparent and more proliferates more in the internet if the policies of the government or policies are not, attuned towards anti-hate speech. And I will say just another example about violence against women. Even again, I go back to the refugee camps because that's a reality, that's a stark reality we have to deal with. When disaster management when what do you say, critical services were allowed for the camps. So the camps were closed down because of social distancing and mobility to all other services except health, shelter, food, and some very critical services like sanitation. But violence against women, many lawyers could not enter the camps, even if they have cases, because it was not considered a critical service. So it is my kind of appeal to UNESCO and other UN bodies, to whoever is dealing with disaster management, to make women-led response and to make violence against women one of the most critical services that one can give during any kind of disasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and a really super important issue to be mentioning. I agree with you. In the interest of the fact that we're running out of time, and I apologize for rushing now, I would like, maybe you can consider these questions from the audience in your final kind of statement from each of our panelists. I know that there's there's a few of you waiting to say something, and I apologize, we're over time, but if you could wrap up, quickly, thinking about those questions from the audience, education, there's another one about youth and the role that youth can play. And what would be the kind of things would be your recommendations for the outcome of this forum? And just before I go to you, I just want to point out to all of the participants that there is a link in the chat box with a survey for you to answer to give feedback on this particular webinar. So please do that before you finish today. So I'm going to go to Professor Shin because he was waiting to comment on one of the questions, but can you please in 2 minutes just wrap up with your final remarks and recommendations? Thank you.
I do not think hate speech is a severe problem. That's the life. So we have to, the hate speech can promote more discussion, and then we can make that kind of situation productive for our growth. So, but I do not accept hate speech. But in Korea, we are trying to have a legislation against hate speech. Hope we can have it soon. But will cause a problem of freedom of press. But still, it is important. But I think that NGO involvement is very important. The city of Gwangju, where I live now, has the largest number of NGO groups in proportion of the population. And then I consider my city is the most inclusive. So NGO involvement is very important. Another about education. The education in Eastern Asia, probably all around the world, we focus too much on competition. So in schools, I used to teach in university, and then in my university, we always emphasize competitiveness. So we should educate, not competitiveness, but collaboration. So competition, we are born to be competitive, but we have to emphasize collaboration in our education. And then we have to teach ourselves to participate. Younger people should learn to participate. So participatory education seems to be important. One more short comment. In addition, participation is important not only in education, but also in NGOs and in politics. The conservative politicians or media, they are trying to make people apolitical. Without participation in politics, without changing the politics of the nation, we cannot change anything. So all our activities should be positively concluded in political system. So I want to, younger people especially, try to participate in politics and then try to give some money, contribution to NGO groups as well, some politicians as well. Without that kind of participation, the future of the world seems to be grim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shin. And Raushan, since you indicated you need to leave, could you perhaps do your wrap up and final? Oh, we have Sohail needing to leave too. So Raushan and then Sohail.
Conclusion of this forum, I think that it is very important to maintain collaboration with national and international NGO, state and international organization in order to learn good practice, especially, for example, in Thailand, they very successfully fight with the COVID, and there are only few cases of the COVID COVID people. So this is of course medical question, but due to the many organization, many NGO works on the medical area, it is good to learn the good practices, good to raise the awareness among women, among vulnerable group, LGBT and migrants, in order to provide for them the sustainable level of life. Also, I think that we need to collaborate with the state in order to raise the question, especially emerged during this COVID-19, in order to develop the new methodology, new tactics, and new strategy, how to solve this problem on the national level, and also regional level on the Central Asia, and international level. And due to some countries have the limitation with the international transportation, anyway, we still have the online some IT technology collaboration, and we need to continue because nobody don't know, especially International Organization of Health, it declares that this COVID will be continued till 1921. So we need to still to develop the strategy and in the new condition. And especially we need to learn more of the positive experience of some countries like Thailand and some Cohesion in Korea and Bangladesh and France, of course, as the UNESCO organization. Of course, the UNESCO organization, as the international organization, works in also the new condition. They need to. We need to reinforce our efforts and in order to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you
And
so much, Raushan.
And also that I want 2 words only, that before I was the vice director of the Kazakh State Legal Academy, we developed that some educational trainings for women and the different for students, for the men's, but now in the new condition, that funding of the NGO are limited during the pandemic. So we still need to arrange kind of different kind of webinars and the online meeting, public discussion, and the joint statement from the government, from the educational community, in order to raise the problem and
okay. Thank you
apply
so much, Raushan.
Okay.
I'm afraid
Okay.
I'm going to have to cut you off to give time to the other speakers now. Professor Sohail.
Thanks so much, Susan. Sorry, the email I had, what it ends Paris time 10:30. So I have, yeah, it's dark here and we're over time. So what I wanted to add on, clearly this is not about COVID-19, right? This is phase one of numerous pandemics coming, phase two of climate change. So this is a whole range of structural collapses in the world system. For young people, it's understanding they're in trauma, one, from us not doing enough, and two, seeing that we can act on COVID-19, but refuse to act in terms of global inclusion and global climate change. So there's a double trauma that has to be addressed. In terms of my own work, what I'm seeing is this huge tension between the inclusion and, with my own colleagues, a spiritual perspective called New Humanism. Our identity is primarily Gaian versus the brutal reality of geopolitics. So we know using exclusion and fear is guaranteed to get electoral victory in the short run. The former president of the European Parliament said, we know what the right thing to do is. We cannot get elected on the right thing to do is. We're seeing many elections everywhere. It's easier to use fear and discrimination because that gets you into power for 3-4 years. So I know with international and agencies I've been working with, we talked about why aren't the 200 commissioners issuing a Black Lives Statement today? We support inclusion. And I had different commissioners on the phone. And that conversation became tense because we were talking about inclusion idealism, and he, I won't say who it was, said, wait, I have interests. The political structures, if I go inclusion, punish me. So our work going from the spiritual perspective for the real political one, how do we increase the chances of prime ministers and ministers shifting towards inclusion? So those are, of course, one, WHO cannot work without teeth. It's nonsense. Nation states are doing well, but a WHO without implementation power on global health policy is just silly. So in Asia Pacific, at least we need to start this conversation about what would Asia Pacific Regional Confederation look like with had real implementation powers around COVID, around climate change, around inclusion, cross-border stuff. And that creates the tension, right? So if I'm a prime minister, the last thing I want is people like us saying be inclusive, because I want to get reelected. What's fortunate for us is we, as Professor Shin was saying, we're learning and we're adapting. And there's a sense the short run fear doesn't translate into long-term victories. So for me, it's telling this new story for young people, telling the new human story, and secondary, having clear metrics throughout the region. We are measuring how you're doing in terms of COVID-19, gender exclusion, all the things we don't want. So that way, prime ministers are forced, they're going to be in the front page tomorrow. They didn't do well on this. So of course we want a cooperative world, but an Asia Pacific ranking system with real metrics helps us push the boundaries so they have a greater incentive to move towards the spiritual guide and inclusionary worldview.
That would be great to see them move in that direction, actually. Kristen, over to you for your final wrap up and recommendations. Thank you, Sohail.
That was interesting what Sohail said, and I agree. So if it's politicians, they can't move forward if they promote inclusion, then it just reinforces the need to work at the community level, because it's community and individuals that elect politicians. And so until we change these narratives at the community level and make that connection, I mean, Sohail said something earlier too, about how we're all humans first. And I often always say we're all migrants first too. I mean, you don't have to look very far. Either yourself, you're a migrant, or very close in your family, somebody's a migrant. And so if you can have that connection, then you can get them to see why inclusivity matters. But right now it's this, we're not driving that narrative. So I think what Sohail has just said is absolutely brilliant and correct. So how do we change those narratives at the community level so that we do, elect politicians who have an inclusive approach? And I mean, Jacinda just got reelected, so somehow she's working on an inclusive approach, and she's been very successful in combat and really fighting COVID because of her approach. So I think somehow we have to work at the community level, because we can have all the laws we want to prohibit and, you know, discrimination. And if they're not implemented, or, you know, you have politicians that use this for political gain, then we're not going to go very far. So it really has to be a grassroots community level, changing this narrative, and showing them the evidence that if we have an inclusive approach, then we are, one, going to combat, you know, xenophobia and racism, and two, we're going to address those other problems that Sohail definitely worries me in coming, you know, climate change and the whole recession coming. So yeah, I think inclusivity is key, and we have to change the narrative at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one final comment over to you, Meghna, for a very quick last comment. And it's come around again to the right person, talking about community.
Yes, and I do have two very specific comments. One is about data, which was mentioned, and that too has to go into the data is so far in the COVID system, we've been looking at individual data, which is how many deaths, how many recovered, etc. But we need to go at the household level, looking at household data and the dynamics within the household. Only then can you really look at the power and the redistribution of resources within households, which will bring up all these the competition and the restrictions that we're talking about. So that in the level of data, that is something we're looking for. And from the community, of course, I will now look at, of course, social cohesion. You know, in recent years, of course, social cohesion has been quite an acceptable term in academics, looking at nexus between cohesion and migration and peace building. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just saying that we should have a look also at social cohesion from a gendered lens, because social cohesion sometimes can mean existing societies with hate speech, with excluded policies of the exclusion. So we have to look at social cohesion as being in a much more national sense as well. And that's where the leadership, both at the community level and at the national level, matters. So far, UNESCO's papers, they say that we have to look at global interaction as opposed to racism and as a combative of racism and discrimination. I also think that we also have to look at, because many states are now organizing themselves more nationally, they want to make their countries great again, etc., but within an international milieu. And in that sense, social cohesion within that country is very important. Or else, if you have divisiveness within that, within the nation or within the country, then of course, no constructive policies will come in combating racism and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. And I do apologize to the participants that we haven't had much time to respond to your questions, but I hope you'll agree with me that listening to the panelists was super interesting and very well worthwhile. Thank you again all for attending. I'm going to hand over now to Anna Maria, who is going to close off the session today. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Yes, Sue, on behalf of Gabriela Ramos and Ana Maria Mylov, my name is Linda Tino Leduaran. I'm working in the Inclusion and Rights section who has organized this webinar. It has been a very rich and insightful discussion. Thank you very, very much to our distinguished panelists. We are very happy to be with you on board for this reflection. We would like to thank once again Ms. Christine Dady, Meghna Guhatakurta, Mr. Sohail Inayatullah, Raushan Nauris-Bayeva, Professor Gyeongyu Shin, and of course, Suvais for this very rich discussion. We have learned a lot from you, and UNESCO stands ready. Frameworks, initiatives, and programs that we are establishing, including the scaling up of the anti-racism and anti-discrimination program of UNESCO. We would like to thank all the participants who tuned in. This is the second to the last edition of the regional consultation series. Tomorrow we will have the consultation with the Arab region at 11 o'clock Paris European time. We will be sending you the questionnaire links to the email addresses that you have used in this webinar, and you can also see the announcement for the next edition. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and we wish you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Bye,
good
everyone.
night.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have
We
a
keep in
great day.
touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.